Welcome back. So we've gotten our setup. Our app is running and functioning, and now we're able to take a look at the code. Again, I like looking at the code once everything is running. You make sure that you've gotten all your environmental variables like API keys from the team and your database is all set up. And if you remember, we have our client app, which is a React app. Where is it? Right here. We have our database that is running locally on our computer. And then we have our server. And I have 3 windows here for each one of these because in the real world, in production, we're most likely going to have these on different servers or different computers. So now that we have everything set up, let's take a walkthrough through the code. I always prefer going through the API first so that I can look at the endpoints because the endpoints tell a lot about the app. And over here, let me minimize this a little bit. Over here, I can start looking at the folder structure. And I see that it's not too complicated. We have a server.js file, which I'm assuming is our main entry point. And then we have controllers. And controllers sound like something that have the logic for our endpoints. So the first thing I'm going to do, look at the folder structure. I've looked already at package.json. I obviously am also going to read the README that the project provides, and then go to the entry point and see what kind of packages they're using. I see that they're using Express body parsers so that we can get the JSON body from a request or request.body. We're using bcrypt, which is a hashing library for most likely hashing passwords. We're using CORS to give access to what domains can access the server. We have Connects, which we've talked about. It's an ORM, which allows us to make SQL statements to our database. And by the way, absolutely love this library. I highly recommend it. It works with MySQL, Postgres, and a ton of other databases. And then we have our controllers, our register, sign in, profile, image. We have our database setup, which we've already talked about. And then we have a basic Express server setup with CORS that allows us to access it from anywhere. So any domain can access it right now. And this is something that we cover in the security section. So we'll leave that for the security section. We have bodyparser.json, again, for us to be able to read JSON from our endpoints. And this is a pretty standard Express server. We're listening to port 3000, and I can see that in the endpoints, we have our sign in, register, profile ID, image, and image URL. And just by reading these endpoints, we have an idea of what the app does. It allows users to sign in and register, to maybe grab each individual profiles, to do some update to the image endpoint, it's a put, and then to post image URL. And I see that each one of them has the handle register, handle profile get, handle image, handle API call. So now I can just go into each controller and just have an overview what each one does. Again, we've seen this before. We set up Clarify API and it looks like the image is just simply saying, I'm going to make an API call to the Clarify API, and we're going to use the face detect model. This is straight from their documentation. And that's going to return their response, their data from the API. And on our end, we also have a handle image. And this handle image looks like we're grabbing the user's database using connects syntax, where the ID equals to the ID of the request.body. And we just increment the entries by 1. And return the entries and return that to the front end. So handle image looks like every time we increment or we send an image, this entry count gets increased. All right, so that's the image file. We look at the profile. Again, handle profile get is pretty self-explanatory. We grab the profile ID. We select everything from the users table. If the ID matches with the request, because remember in the server.js, we are doing this semicolon ID to grab the parameters of what the request was. And again, we're just returning the users that we get from the database. For register, a little bit more complicated, but looking at it, we're just handling register. Looks like we're hashing our passwords, which is really, really good security practice. Again, this is something that we're going to talk about and have an exercise on in the security section. And it looks like we update, so we insert the hash and the email in the login table. And then we also use the users table to insert the email, name, and the date that is joined. So that's just the registering. And then finally for sign in, with handling sign in, we're simply selecting the email and the hash from the login table if the email matches whatever the front end gave us. And then we do something called bgrypt compare, again, something that we talk about in the security section, where we compare the password to the hash that is stored in the database. Again, a safe way to store information about the user and allow them to log in. If it's valid, we give them the user information. Otherwise, we say wrong credentials. All right, so that's not too bad. That was a nice run through. We don't have to learn too much about the code base. And mind you, on some projects, you'll get on and there's a lot more folders. But with a logical step-by-step, you have an idea what the app does, especially now that you've gone through the app. You can kind of guess where each one of these endpoints are used. Let's go to the front-end app. The front-end app, right away, we see that is a React project. And we can just open up our source folder, and usually they'll have a components, a container folder, and other folders that you can see. But you always want to start off with index.js. Make sure that you see whatever libraries that they're using. It looks like they're using tachyons for styling. And on the index.js, it looks like there's no provider here, so they're not using Redux, just simple React app, and that the entry point is the app. So again, we go to app.js and we see what the main component has. We see that they're using a lot of components here. And the first thing I like to do is to look at the initial state that the app needs. Again, because we're not using Redux, the state usually lives in the components. And we see that there's input, image URL. We have something called box, which we're not too sure of. We see that the route is signed in is false, and then we have user information. Again, just by looking at the state, we have an idea of what the app information is going to look like, the state. In the app, we see that, all right, we have the load user, we have the calculate face location. And again, this is why it's important to name your functions really well, because if you have a new team member coming onto the project, it's nice for them to say, oh, okay, so this calculates where the face location is in the image, just by the name. We have the display face box. We have the on input change, which probably could be a little bit more descriptive. On button submit, and we see that we do a few fetch calls. So on button submit looks like a very important one because we have fetch, another fetch here, and we're doing all these things. So we should get back to this and see what it's doing. We have on route change, which again looks like we're handling routes. And I also like looking at the component, the main component, and seeing, all right, so they're loading up a navigation. Particles, which is what we see over here, this cool background that moves around. We see that we have the navigation with sign in and route change. And then we see that if the route is home, we give them the logo, rank, image link form, and face recognition. And then if it's not, we give them the sign in or register component. So immediately we kind of have an idea of the structure of the app. And just by looking at this, we see where we can improve, how things could be cleaned up. We also see that, oh yeah, this app component is getting pretty big with all these methods. Maybe Redux might be a good thing to start looking at, or perhaps having more than one container. All things that you can do as you browse through the code. But I want to give you a side note here. A lot of programmers, when they first come onto a project, the first thing they do is criticize. They look at this code and say, whoa, what's with all this? This is terrible. This looks so ugly. Like, what's with this on input change function name that's not descriptive at all? Whoever wrote this is so dumb. I should change this. And oh, this is too ugly. Like, this is already too much complication. We should have extra components here that is a lot neater. And this happens quite a lot, where a person comes onto the project and immediately starts criticizing the code. And yes, there's definitely things that we can improve here, but a senior developer knows that when they come onto a project, it's not necessarily why did they put the on input change here? That's such a non-descriptive name. But they weren't there when this function was written. They weren't there when this component was created, when the decision was made to make routing like this. And with that lack of information, you don't have that right to necessarily criticize. I mean, constructive criticism and saying, this could be improved is a good way of looking at it. But you can't go and say, this is wrong, this is terrible code, I have to fix all of this. Because you don't know what the developers at the time knew. Maybe they were under a time crunch. Maybe they were training a junior developer and this was their first PR. As a senior developer, you look at this in an unemotional way, looking at the code, seeing where in the future you might want to improve the code, but without criticism, just being completely neutral. Because when you come on a project, the goal is not to stand out and improve and make everything better. The goal is to integrate into the project with the team and work together to make the project better. I know I kind of went on a tangent here, but it's so important because it's something that I see all the time. And it really is an unfortunate characteristic that I think some of the top developers that I've seen have this, where they look at the code neutrally without criticism. All right, just went on a tangent there. Let's get back on track. All right, so let's just take a look at the on button submit. If I go to the on button submit here, where is it? It looks like at the image link form, I have the on button submit and on input change. Just by the names, I know that, all right, it's most likely this. So this detect button, that's where we're doing all those fetch calls, seems like the most important part of the app. And I can take a look at these fetch calls to see what's happening in the app. All right, so I am fetching to localhost 3000 image URL. So that's our API server. And we're doing a post request. And this image URL, if we go to that endpoint, we see that, oh yeah, it's handling the API call. Remember, this is what makes the call to the Clarifai API. And it handles the API call, and that's it. It returns the data. So right away, we see that, okay, we're getting the data from Clarifai. It's going to have a response. And this response, if we have a response, we do another fetch call to the image endpoint. That is a put. And if you remember, this was the endpoint that incremented our entries. So if everything succeeds and we get a response, we increment the number, the entries, by 1. And then once we get all of that, we update the state to increase the user's entries count. Okay, that makes sense. So that's what happens when we hit detect and the number increases here. But what about the face detection? Well, the face detection, again, we have a nice name here. Once everything goes through, we display the face box. Kind of a weird name. I came up with it, but it probably could be improved. And it says that we display the face by calculating the face location. Again, it kind of reads nicely. We know what's happening here. All right, and then we obviously have the components that we can take a look at, but they're all descriptive enough, and we have an idea of if we need a feature implemented, where to look. So there you go. It wasn't that bad. Just by going through the code, looking at the endpoints, and then some of the main containers and components, we have an idea of what the app does. And you don't need to right away understand the entire code, because that will come over time. As you start working on features and bugs, you're going to discover different pieces of the code. Because as the code bases get larger and larger, it really becomes more and more difficult to have everything in your head of how things work. So Don't feel overwhelmed if you come onto a project and they have tons of folders that you have no idea what they're doing. Like with anything, just take it bits by bits, understand the high-level concepts, how everything fits together, how the dots are connected, and when a feature request, such as, hey, can we make this detect more than one face? When that comes, you start working on that feature and get really familiar to perhaps the face recognition component and maybe the calculate face location function, and you slowly start to understand the project. But the main thing is you want to have an idea of what the overall picture is. Never focus on the small things first. Always start with the big picture and slowly narrow down your focus. So with that said, we have to implement a feature that Bruno asked. That is to have multiple face detections. Because if I go back here and let's do an image that has multiple faces, let me see if I can have people, and let's do this picture. I'm going to copy image address and paste it here. Oh no, that's good. That's a URL. And I click detect. All right, looks like it's only detecting one face, but not the other. So in the next video, we're going to fix that based on the code review that we just did, based on the analysis that we just did, and go about it in a smart way. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.